On a few of our other episodes and the Quick Tip Tuesdays, we have talked about what we wanted guys to do with their training while they're not throwing. So today, following up on last week's video about intro into on-ramping and figuring out how to get back into throwing coming off a shutdown period, we're going to talk about training while on-ramping. So again, we're going off from a period of not throwing at all to building back up. And towards the end of the month, our guys that are going to go into a velo development phase will start really heating up around December 16th. Where they're doing 2 days a week of pretty high intensity throwing, if not 100% max intensity on those 2 days. So some of the things that we look at as we are continuing to program in the weight room with those guys, and as they're building back up, there will be some changes, and you can see a lot of these directly correlate to some things that we were doing during the off season, during that shutdown period. So number one would be decreasing the direct shoulder and forearm work with throwing, obviously on your throwing arm. As you're ramping up, every day, every throw you make, you're going to get more and more direct shoulder and forearm work. So we don't want to be a dead horse, and that's going to be, you're going to hear me say that a few times as we go through this. We're using the forearm to protect the elbow, flexion, extension of the wrist, exterior, external and internal rotation of the shoulder, all these sort of things. We're getting that every time we throw a baseball, so we're not going to come in, especially before, but after we're throwing, we might do some type of recovery methods, or we might add in some lesser volume exercises to help maintain the range of motion that hopefully we have gained in the off season. But we're not going to be hammering those things, and it'll be in a lower volume. We will also not be doing something like heavy eccentrics with external rotation, especially, or like heavy manual resisted exercises. Where they're going to be just higher intensity and more wear and tear in that area throughout the week. So we'll start transitioning off of those, and they'll be getting more of their direct work with their actual throwing. We're going to work more out of the sagittal plane. We're talking about range of motion. Sagittal plane is front and back. So forward and back, think reverse lunge, forward lunge, that's the easiest way to describe it. So we're going to get out of the sagittal plane, and we're going to start looking at more frontal and transverse planes. So that means frontal is side to side, lateral movements, or transverse is rotational, so like throwing a med ball, something like that. So we're going to get more into working all three planes of motion and get out of just sagittal. While there hasn't been a ton of research that can correlate being specifically strong and powerful in the frontal plane to like throwing harder, we want to make sure that all of our athletes, no matter what sport, are moving in all three planes of motion. After we're kind of building the base, we're probably doing more in the sagittal plane and less in the frontal transverse, and we're going to move more into all three planes of motion. So that will be a main difference during this transitional period. When we, along with that, we're addressing movement issues in three planes of motion. So how is that different from what I just said? We're looking specifically at something like internal rotation of the hip. When we look at internal rotation of the hip, we might use a pail and a rail, or a PRI exercise where we're laying on the ground. We're really working specifically like the glute med, or doing a pail and rail and really pushing it on the ground and just trying to lift the foot up. And we're trying to gain range of motion by doing those exercises. After we've hopefully gained that range of motion, we're then going to put them into an exercise that's moving in three planes of motion. And this is something we'll go over later and be more specific with. But we're think lead leg block, like as you plant with your front leg, and you start to rotate into your front leg. I know you can't see my leg right now, but start rotating into your front leg. That is internal rotation. And so we would do motion, would start adding in motions like that, where we're specifically trying to maintain that front leg stiffness as we rotate and extend the leg through the hip rotation, and not just lay on the ground and do an internal rotation exercise. So that would be the base example of using those movement issues, hopefully, that we've eliminated, and start making it more of like a pitching motion. The other thing with that would also be like something like rotation and hip and shoulder separation, where we might do a lot of things seated, where they're squeezing something between their knees to keep their lower body in place and rotating the upper body. We're going to take that and make it standing or split stance or pitching position to help them obviously transition into being able to keep that hip and shoulder separation during a throwing motion. Another big piece of this is decreasing the volume of overhead med ball throws, and rotational core is very vague, so I'll dive into that a little bit. But again, think of this more of a general concept and not a specific rule that's written in stone. So again, same thing we've talked about with beating a dead horse. We don't want to be doing a ton of overhead med ball throws. So something that's light, high speed, and using some of the same movements and patterns that we do throwing a baseball. If we are also throwing, we should be getting this type of movement, both of these types of movement, while we're throwing a baseball, just like we're getting this type of work in while we're throwing a baseball. So we're not going to do a ton before or after. If we're doing it as a prep, great. If we're doing it in really low doses, where you're doing maybe a total of 6 overhead throws, the entire workout, fine, not a big deal. But we're going to be doing less of that, especially as the throwing ramps up. If we're doing something, like a pull down or throwing off the mound at 100%, then that probably would be used more in a warm-up manner, rather than something that they're getting 3 or 4 times a week in their workout for multiple sets. Same idea with rotational core. I mean, again, it's very general. You can go 18 different ways and probably make 18 different arguments on both sides of the argument here, but what we're looking for here is where we have someone that's, I call them block movers. They don't separate really at all. And so we're spending some time in November when they're not throwing, really hammering hip-shoulder separation and doing everything we can during their workout to help them understand the sequencing pattern and get better sequencing in their movements once we start putting it back together, back to the 3 planes of motion. So we're going to start phasing that type of movement out, and we probably would make that rotational core some type of more of the 3 plane of motion thing. And again, you could argue that rotational core is 3 planes of motion, but just being a little bit more specific here. The last thing that we would really start to change in the weight room, and this is maybe the biggest one, is we're going to decrease the lifting volume, especially. So lifting volume goes down as throwing volume increases. So again, we talked about hypertrophy clusters and some other things, methods of training like that, but we want to make sure that lifting volume decreases as throwing volume increases, and we start transitioning to max strength or power. That's going to depend on back to the strength speed continuum, where that person is on that continuum, on that line, and which bucket they need to fill the most. So some guys, especially now it's beginning in December, they're not as strong on the max strength side of things, so they're going to be going into max strength, and for the next probably 3 weeks, and it's going to be a very low volume. And then as they're continuing on ramping it closer and closer tryouts, we're going to go more towards power or some type of peaking for them, which would be lighter and faster. And again, it's lighter and faster relative to what they've been doing. So that's how we would probably look at the next 6 weeks, with tryouts in about 6 weeks for travel ball here. 3 more weeks of max strength possibly, and then going into power. Or if it's someone that's really strong, we're going into power now, and then going into speed strength later on to help them peak. So again, these are some just basic principles. There's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, as one of my mentors says, and this is just some of the general principles that we look at when we're helping transition our athletes from going from a shutdown period, on ramping, to really getting into the meat of the throwing program in the off season.